Professor Takai, your featured speech at the Asian Conference on Psychology and the Behavioral Sciences looks at differences between Japanese and non-Japanese, but particularly in the case of conflict.
Yes.
And the issue of avoidance. And this is something that those people who know the Japanese quite well know that, in fact, the avoidance of conflict is very important to the way Japanese society functions.
Yeah.
And so for those of us who have worked in Japan, it's sometimes frustrating to have a discussion or a debate where ideas are exchanged. And it's of course something that it's a cultural difference of which we're immediately aware. But then if you've been in Japan, sometimes you realize, of course, it's just different. So perhaps you can comment on those cultural differences, the subject of your talk.
Sure. I think it has something to do with the social cultural infrastructure. And of course, the culture has to be prepared to welcome such avoiding issues. I think Japan is based on a society where maintaining interpersonal harmony is more important than getting your way, getting your assertions heard by the other person. So the preference for conflict is to avoid the conflict as much as possible. And this goes back to our schooling. And in the speech, I talked about the practices of the school, which really does not prepare the kids to deal with conflict, because there is no need to deal with conflict. And the assumption is that everyone gets along without any conflict. And so the schools really don't prepare us for how to deal with conflict management. And one of the issues, such as debate education, which does not exist, because debate it creates conflict. And of course, in the Western cultures, probably debate is a very important part of the curriculum, and that gets your opinions out, and you're heard by the other person, and you become more eloquent in doing so. But in our culture, that's not required, because the assumption is there should be no conflict.
Do you find that Japanese academics find it more difficult to engage in academic conferences, discussions, where there's quite a lot of testing of ideas and challenging discussions? Do you think that Japanese find it difficult to separate an argument, an abstract argument, from the person and making something personal?
Well, actually, that's a different world. With the academicians, they want to get the one up on the other guy, pointing out some of the faults of the research and making that person look better than the other person. And I find that in practice there's no difference, except the Japanese would be a little bit more subtle in criticizing somebody's research. And the typical practice would be to thank the person for making a wonderful discussion or a wonderful presentation, and then getting into criticism. Whereas you would get right into the criticism if you go to a Western conference. So in essence, it's the same thing. It's just a matter of how you do it. It's less obvious in the Japanese world, and there's also a care to respect the face of the other person.
So let's look at that conflict and that conflict avoidance. Of course, most people consider avoiding conflict, in fact, to be good and a good thing. But in what cases is avoiding conflict, in actual fact, harmful and unhealthy?
Okay, it depends on the cost to you, the person who avoids. And if it's something very important to you, you stand to lose a lot if you avoid the issue rather than talk it out. But on the other hand, if you bring it up with the other person, it's going to be a lot of stress on you, because you have to be prepared to get into a verbal argument. Also, the other person might get some their emotions heightened up, and you're dealing with a very explosive situation when you bring up an issue, and especially when the other person isn't prepared for it and is taken off guard, and might take it as an insult. Whereas if it's a society where avoiding is not the norm, people are used to it, and if they're criticized, they'll be on their guard, but they can handle it pretty well, and there's no need for that much feeling of getting insulted or feeling hurt from just having a difference in opinion brought up. But to the Japanese, because they're not used to it, I think it's more hurtful for them to have the other person express their views, since avoiding is used so much.
You're fluent in both Japanese and English, and have spent a large amount of your adult life, in fact, in the United States. And it's been argued that we inhabit different personalities when we use different languages. So do you find that do you find it easier to engage in arguments, or if you like, conflicts in English than Japanese? And if so, do you feel there's less at stake?
Well, I don't think my personality changes. I've always been a very peace-loving person, and would not engage in conflict. I would avoid, even as a child, and actually it was Canada, not United States, but growing up in Canada, I would avoid conflict as much as possible. And because of that, I was pretty popular, I think. I was the easygoing guy, and not somebody who poses a threat. But I felt so much easier. It was easier to get along with people in Japan because there'd be less conflict in the whole society itself. In my relationships, I don't have to deal with conflict. A lot of the times, the Japanese people will recognize your needs without you having to ever say it, and they would act on it. Maybe if you had a displeased look on your face, they'll pick up on it, and they'll try to decide what was the problem and work on it before you need to say it. And the issue is that if you're so insensitive that you have to let the other person tell you something, then you stand to lose your face. It's a shame on you. So people are constantly pretty sensitive to each other, and I kind of appreciate that a lot, whereas you have to say it out loud for most Canadians to really pick up on what your problem is.
Professor Takai, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe.